Super Smash Bros. Is the biggest video game crossover of all time. Believe me, I've collected every single spirit. Don't look at that. But with this comes the need to justify itself. Why are Solid Snake and Sans Undertale duking it out in Mortal Kombat? With the need to justify itself, of course, Smash Bros. Doesn't do that. They're just in the same universe because why not? But the universe that they're in, as an amalgamation of every crossover universe, has its own unique identity that goes completely overlooked. I've always been fascinated by small details in video games that help the narrative in larger whole, the unsung heroes, the forgettable things that really affect the moment-to-moment experience of the game. And there is literally nothing as forgettable as Battlefield in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. That sounds like an insult, but really, I love this stage. I've been playing Smash competitively for 4 years, and I played Smash Ultimate the day it came out when I was nearly 10 years old, and really upset that it had to come out the same day as my church ward's stupid Christmas celebration, which, to this day, is still the worst thing the Mormon church did to my developing mind. The worst thing. But throughout the past 8 years, I've never stopped to ask the most crucial question about this stage, the most basic level of analysis. What the hell is this stage doing here? Smash Bros. Combat differentiates itself from other fighting games by literally inventing an entirely new genre, the platform fighter, the verticality of the combat being emphasized above previously established core aspects of the genre like comboing, complex input systems, or being balanced at all in any way. Infamously, Sakurai has despised Smash being a serious competition or esport for as long as the series has existed, deliberately making his games objectively worse just so that the wrong kind of people won't play them. This is something that I can find simultaneously admirable and unhinged. Personally, I may ruin the pacing of my videos on occasion to include a joke that acts as a filter so right-wingers aren't welcome here. Of course, it's easier to just wear a skirt. But if Sakurai's version of cross-dressing is the 4 glory and 4 fun modes in Smash 4, I think it's time for an intervention. Smash original content has always been bizarre, starting with Smash 64's cage match aesthetic, and its final destination looking like it came straight out of a Mario 64 iceberg image. And then Melee's trophy description reading,
"As time passes on this stage, the level appears to travel through a wormhole from the imaginary Super Smash Bros. Melee world into reality. You move through a cloud-filled sky over a vast mountain range, then into a deep space vista of dark blues and purples. The scenery is as real as you get in this fantastical world."
which is a very interesting thing for it to say, claiming the final destination of Smash Bros. Is literally the real world where you and your friends who are sitting together on the couch experience it. The truth of Smash Bros. Is neglecting the video game world and appreciating the real world that we're in. The game is just an accessory to the friends we made along the way.
I love you all so much.
Brawl features the same concept. It also has Final Destination at the end of its story mode, and it's where you fight Taboo, the manifestation of the stigma surrounding childhood worlds of imagination. The scenery is as real as you get in this fantastical world. And when played in multiplayer, Brawl's FD goes through the same transition from space to Earth. Smash 4, despite the neglect of any story resembling single-player modes, uses FD in the same way, a climactic trek from space to Earth, and Smash Ultimate's FD is beautiful. Instead of transitioning to the real world to represent Smash Ultimate's ambitions thematically, it takes cues from the World of Light story mode, representing Smash's themes. It's only one more step removed, and uses that space to have a gorgeous and stunning display of a battle between light and dark, constantly shifting. So what's the deal with Battlefield? Battlefield, contrary to FD, is just there for the purposes of gameplay. It isn't used for final bosses in the single-player modes, but rather for more traditional gameplay in the single-player modes. And instead of reflecting the themes of breaking free from the shackles of fiction and these characters coming to life in our hearts— sorry, I just realized this video might not make sense to people who haven't looked into all this stuff. I'd recommend the Cursed Judges video on Subspace Emissary and maybe Matt Pats if you're feeling silly. Where was I? Instead of FD's beautiful representation of the ideals and dreams of Smash Bros., Battlefield isn't that. Reading from Melee's trophy description again,
Super Smash Bros. Melee borrows settings from many different games to create its stages, but the battlefield is an original creation. While its initial impression may strike some players as a bit ominous, the layout itself is fairly standard, lending to serious, straightforward matches.
This is fascinating. The stage is ominous because there's no reason for it. Final Destination can feel ominous, but that's because it's about ascending from the darkness of fiction to reality, as explained in its trophy description. But while Battlefield also has the gimmick of the background changing as the stage progresses, it doesn't change to anything brighter. It's just slightly different versions of space. The final line of its description really makes this clear.
Additionally, it's used to pit players against the fighting wireframes.
And that's what this incarnation of Battlefield is all about, the opposite of Final Destination. This is the main step on the journey, the representation of Smash at its most straightforward, serious level, and yet it's a clear encapsulation of the game's unnerving aesthetic. Battlefield has the same kind of high-tech aesthetic of the rest of the game, an evolution from 64's cage match aesthetic. Melee's vibes go for space, technology, and I regret to inform you that I was born in 2008, and thus I feel inclined to use the word liminal. The wireframe enemies represent that, the menus represent that. The fact that this game's mission statement was to act as the GameCube's introduction rather than as a sequel to the original, and thus it had to make the GameCube's hardware seem futuristic and dark and gritty. This Y2K aesthetic, monitors everywhere, it's oddly reminiscent of Serial Experiments Lane, and if my audience is correct, everyone will know intrinsically what I'm talking about. Battlefield is the culmination of all of these themes. Space, neon colors, a bright central core, but also spikes everywhere, and two strange, thin hands clutching the core that presumably gives Battlefield its levitating power. Battlefield is where you fight the wireframes, the wireframes themselves being representative of the artifice of Smash. There's no illusion of crossover, no illusion of character. It has the same vibes as a game with broken or missing textures because it is the game taken down to its most base elements, which, in the case of Melee, was apparently skeletal hands holding up a floating, janky platform. Brawl had considerably more time to cook in the oven, coming out less like a melted jumble of ingredients that can kind of taste good if you cut off most of it, to being one cohesive, wonderful dish that looks a whole lot better and probably tastes better too. But a lot of people just really like licking the spatula, which is why Melee still exists. Brawl's Battlefield, unlike Melee's, has a wholly different aesthetic to the single other playable Smash original stage, Final Destination, instead being ruins. In the Italian translation, they are literally the ruins, and this was where Brawl's reveal trailer was set. This is what polished Smash Bros. Looks like, the entire game painted with a retroactively uncanny brush. Battlefield still floating, still having a core, yet existing in a formerly prosperous kingdom that has been utterly forgotten. Much has been said about Brawl's bizarre choice of theming, the quality and eccentricities of the subspace emissary, yet Battlefield exists nowhere in this world. In Brawl's story mode, you'd expect to find some explanation of Battlefield's setting, but nowhere in subspace does Battlefield exist. Smash Bros. Was a kingdom, but now it's literally just disorganized fights and violence. A kingdom that once stood strong, completely forgotten. We know nothing of these ruins but for the fact that they represent destruction and decay and neglect. And then Smash 4 did the same thing. And then Smash Ultimate did the same thing, except that in Smash Ultimate's rendition of Battlefield, we find that it does match with the aesthetic of Smash's single-player mode, World of Light. World of Light, of course, being a literal ruined land, after Galeem wiped out all of life in the galaxy, transforming everything into spirits that endlessly unconsciously wander. This amalgamation of every video game world emerged as a result. Distant sparks call to a past still unnamed. Battlefield in Smash Ultimate is much more visually stunning than all of its predecessors, which for the most part can be attributed to it running on superior hardware and having a much more precisely defined art direction. Smash Ultimate's floating battlefield still has a core in the middle, the island flying high above a wholly unnatural occurring water cascade, seemingly implying that the entire kingdom simply rose out of the ground. Jagged ice spiking out of the water with no apparent explanation. The only thing that exists in this new incarnation of Battlefield is questions. But there can be no answers, because there aren't. For a stage that previously represented Smash at its most bare bones, the amount of effort and detail poured into this stage is remarkable, as evidenced by the fact that I'm remarking upon it right now, and attention-grabbing in the sense that no one has ever paid attention to these details for more than like a second. I was lying. The crumbled arch in the background, the ice on top and below the stage, the waterfalls in the distance, the day-night cycle, these represent nothing. Battlefield represents the gameplay of Smash above all else, and if this is meant less as a genuine display for players to read into and more as a representation of Smash Ultimate's aesthetic, it succeeds, exclusively in the sense that it's visually impressive but utterly vacuous. This could, ironically, be a success in and of itself. Smash Bros. Has always been about creativity, intentionally placing highly contrasting characters in juxtaposed environments. This landscape exists to get the players to ask questions which will always be more captivating to the youthful spirit of imagination and post-hoc world building than strict answers from the mouth of an elderly Japanese man. Battlefield shines specifically because of its forgettableness. as its lack of a distinct identity is entirely necessary in order to give Smash Ultimate, and thereby the series, its own incredibly unique identity structured around it. This ruins environment, that has been the only shared continuity between the Smash series ever since Brawl, has been shared for each victory screen as well. The fact that this battlefield is always where these characters end up, even after the battle has concluded, speaks to the nature of Smash as a universe of imagination and childhood fantasy, with a call towards building a story out of pre-existing plot points and characters that must be retrofitted to a story that was dreamt up by a child. Battlefield is Smash Bros, specifically in the sense that it outwardly refuses to justify itself, because explaining anything, giving rules to anything, would inherently make the world and concept less unique, less magical, and plainly less fun.